The sound of his fist against the bedroom door shattered whatever remained of Beth Mooney's fractured sleep. Her body jerked awake, hands instinctively wrapping around the swell of her belly where the baby had been kicking restlessly through the night. The contractions had started hours ago, irregular but insistent, like warnings she couldn't afford to heed. The room was still dark, that suffocating pre-dawn darkness that made everything feel like a nightmare you couldn't wake from. "Get up!" Joe Denley's voice came through the wood, sharp and cold. "My parents are awake and they're hungry." Beth pressed her palms against her lower back, where the pain had settled like broken glass grinding into her spine. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She'd been up until past midnight cleaning the guest rooms, washing sheets that were already clean, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, all because Joe's mother had run her finger along the windowsill and made that disapproving sound in the back of her throat. The sound that meant Beth had failed again at being the wife the Denley family deserved. "Did you hear me?" The door shook under another blow. "I said get up." She pulled herself to sitting, her swollen feet barely recognizing the floor as she placed them down. The baby shifted inside her, pressing against ribs that felt like they might crack from the weight of carrying this child, while carrying the burden of this marriage. 3 years. 3 years since she'd stood in a church and promised to love Joe Denley for better or worse, having no idea that worse had depth she couldn't have imagined in her most anxious moments. The door swung open before she could stand. Joe filled the frame, backlit by the hallway light, his face cast in shadows that made him look like a stranger. Except he wasn't a stranger anymore. This was who he'd become. Or perhaps who he'd always been beneath the charm he'd worn during their courtship, like an expensive suit he only brought out for special occasions. "Are you deaf?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand clamped around her upper arm, fingers digging into the bruise he'd left there 2 days earlier when she'd asked if they could cancel his parents' visit. "I have been calling you." "Joe, please." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, weaker than she meant. "I'm not feeling well. The baby, something feels wrong. Something feels wrong," he repeated, his tone mocking cruel. "You know what's wrong? You're lazy. You're pathetic. My mother said she's never seen a more useless pregnant woman in her entire life, and she's worked with charity cases." He pulled her to her feet with a jerk that sent lightning bolts of pain shooting down her legs. Beth gasped, doubling over, but his grip only tightened. "Stand up straight. You think my parents want to see you shuffling around like some kind of victim? They're already questioning why I married you." The hallway felt like a tunnel, stretching impossibly long as he dragged her toward the stairs. Every step was agony. The contractions were coming closer now. She was certain of it. Waves of pressure that built and built until she thought she might break in half. But saying anything would only make it worse. Joe didn't believe in weakness, not in himself, and certainly not in her. The kitchen lights were already blazing when they reached the bottom floor. Joe's mother sat at the head of the table like a queen holding court, her silver hair perfectly styled, despite the early hour. She wore a silk robe that probably cost more than Beth's entire wardrobe, and her expression when she looked at Beth could have frozen fire. "Well," she said, drawing out the word, "look who finally decided to join us." Joe's father stood by the coffee maker, dressed in slacks and a pressed shirt, even though dawn hadn't broken yet. He'd been a judge before retirement, and he still carried that air of absolute authority, as if every room he entered was his courtroom, and everyone in it was subject to his verdict. "Good morning," Beth managed, her hand still pressed against her belly where the pain was intensifying. "Is it?" Joe's mother raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "I've been awake for over an hour, and I've yet to see any evidence of breakfast preparation." "Joe, darling, did you explain to your wife that we expect to eat before 7? "I explained." Joe released Beth's arm with a slight shove that sent her stumbling against the kitchen counter. "Some people just don't listen." Beth gripped the edge of the granite countertop, trying to steady herself as another contraction hit. This one was stronger, unmistakable. Her water hadn't broken yet, but she knew deep in that primal place where mothers always know that something was very wrong. The baby had stopped moving. That restless kicking that had kept her awake had gone still. "I need to go to the hospital." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was worse than any shouting. Joe's mother set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. His father turned from the coffee maker, his expression unreadable. Joe's face went red, a flush that started at his collar and spread upward like spilled wine. "Excuse me?" His mother's voice could have cut diamond. "You need to go to the hospital? Right now? When we have guests in the house?" "The baby," Beth tried to explain, but her voice was shaking. "Something's not right. Please, I think I'm in labor." "You think?" Joe's father spoke for the first time, his voice carrying that judicial tone that turned statements into judgments. "You think you're in labor, or you know you're in labor. There's a significant difference. Please, can someone take me?" The laughter started with Joe's mother, a light tinkling sound that might have been pleasant if it wasn't directed at Beth's fear. Joe's father smiled, shaking his head like a teacher disappointed in a particularly dim student. And Joe, her husband, the father of the child she was carrying, looked at her with something beyond contempt. It was disgust. "You're unbelievable," he said. "Do you know that? My parents come to visit, you can't even make them a simple breakfast, and now you're going to fake a medical emergency to get out of your responsibilities." "I'm not faking." Beth's legs were trembling now, barely holding her weight. "Please, Joe, please." "She's putting on quite a performance," his mother observed, examining her manicured nails. "I've seen this before, you know. Women who use pregnancy as an excuse for everything. They think carrying a child means the world should stop spinning for them." Joe's sister appeared in the doorway, drawn by the voices. She was younger than Joe, sharper in a way that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with cruelty. She took in the scene with one sweeping glance and smiled. "What's going on? Is the princess demanding room service?" "The princess," Joe's father said, "apparently thinks she's in labor." "Apparently?" His sister laughed, coming further into the kitchen. "Let me guess. You want us all to drop everything and rush you to the hospital where you'll miraculously feel better the second we arrive." Beth felt something inside her tear, and she didn't know if it was physical or something deeper, some fundamental part of her that had been holding on despite everything finally letting go. She reached for her phone on the counter, but Joe was faster. He snatched it away, holding it above his head like she was a child reaching for a toy. "No," he said simply. "You're not calling anyone. You're not going anywhere. You're going to make breakfast for my family, and then maybe, if you behave yourself, we'll discuss whether you really need medical attention or if you're just being dramatic like usual." "Joe." Beth's voice broke on his name. "I'm begging you." "Then beg better," his mother suggested. "Get on your knees and beg like you mean it." They were all watching her now, 4 pairs of eyes, 4 faces, showing varying degrees of amusement and disgust. The pain in her belly had become constant, no longer coming in waves, but present like a hand squeezing her insides. She thought about dropping to her knees, thought about begging the way Joe's mother suggested, thought about doing whatever it took to make them understand this wasn't manipulation or drama or laziness. But her knees buckled before she could decide. Beth grabbed for the counter, missed, and felt herself falling. The tile floor rushed up to meet her, and she had just enough time to turn her body, to protect her belly even as her shoulder took the impact. The crack echoed through the kitchen, bone meeting stone, and for a moment the world went white with pain. She lay there, curled on her side, her hand pressed against her stomach where she still couldn't feel the baby moving. Above her she could hear voices, but they seemed far away, distorted. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Joe's mother said. "Now she's on the floor." "This is exactly the kind of theatrical behavior I was talking about. Should we call someone?" That was his sister, but she didn't sound concerned, just curious. "And tell them what?" Joe's father asked. "That our daughter-in-law fell down because she's clumsy? Let her lie there until she's ready to stop this nonsense." Beth's fingers found the pocket of her robe. Her old phone was there, the one she'd kept hidden after Joe took away her new one, the one she'd charged in secret outlets and hidden in places he wouldn't look. It was her lifeline, her only connection to the world outside this house. She'd programmed one number into it, just one. Her friend from college who'd stayed in touch even when Beth stopped answering calls, who'd sensed something was wrong even when Beth insisted everything was fine. With fingers that barely worked, slick with sweat or blood or tears, Beth pulled out the phone. She couldn't see the screen clearly. Her vision was blurring at the edges, but she knew where the buttons were. She typed out one word, sent it to the only contact saved, and let the phone slip from her hand to slide under the refrigerator where they wouldn't find it. The word was simple, just 4 letters, but it contained everything she couldn't say out loud. It was surrender and fight all at once. It was the end of one life and the desperate, terrified hope that another life might still be possible. Help. The darkness came slowly, then all at once. Beth's last conscious thought was of the baby, silent and still inside her, and whether she'd just killed them both by marrying a man who looked at her collapse and saw only inconvenience. Above her, Joe was telling his mother not to worry, that she always did this, that she'd get up in a minute and stop embarrassing everyone. But Beth wasn't getting up. Her eyes closed, and the last thing she heard was Joe's sister saying something about how she deserved this, how any woman who trapped a good man with a pregnancy deserved exactly what she got. The words followed Beth down into the dark, and somewhere in that darkness, she made a promise to the silent baby in her belly. If they survived this, she would never let anyone make her feel small again. Chapter 2. The Awakening. White ceiling tiles. That was the first thing Beth registered when consciousness dragged her back to the surface. Not the ceiling of her bedroom with its crown molding that Joe's mother had picked out. Not the kitchen floor where she'd fallen. White tiles with tiny holes, the kind that absorbed sound in hospitals and funeral homes, and places where people went when their bodies betrayed them. Her throat felt raw, scraped clean of moisture. When she tried to swallow, nothing happened except a clicking sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. Machines beeped somewhere to her left, a steady rhythm that her heartbeat tried to match and couldn't quite find. There were tubes in her arm, tape pulling at the sensitive skin on the inside of her elbow. The baby. The thought came like lightning, sudden and illuminating and terrifying. Her hand moved before her brain could catch up, sliding across her stomach, searching for the swell that had been there, that had to still be there. But her belly felt different, softer, deflated like something essential had been removed. Easy now. A voice cut through her panic, female and gentle. Don't try to move too fast. You've been through quite an ordeal. Beth's head turned, the motion sending sparks of pain down her neck. A nurse stood beside the bed, older woman with kind eyes and hands that knew how to touch without hurting. She was checking one of the machines, making notes on a tablet, and when she looked at Beth, her expression held something that might have been pity. "Where's my baby?" Beth's voice came out broken, barely recognizable as her own. "Please, where is he?" "Your son is in the NICU." The nurse moved closer, adjusting the bed so Beth could sit up slightly. "He's fighting hard, sweetheart. Born 3 weeks early, but he's a fighter. The doctors are optimistic. Soon, she had a son." Beth felt tears slide down her temples into her hair, hot and fast and unstoppable. She had a son, and he was alive and fighting, and that meant whatever happened next, whatever price she had to pay for surviving, it was worth it. "Can I see him?" The words caught in her throat. "Please, I need to see him. Soon, right now. You need to understand what happened to you." The nurse pulled up a chair, sitting at eye level with Beth in a way that suggested this conversation wasn't going to be easy. "You suffered something called a placental abruption. Your placenta separated from the wall of your uterus. It's a medical emergency, Beth. You lost a dangerous amount of blood. Another hour, maybe less, and we would have lost both of you. Another hour. Beth thought about lying on that kitchen floor, while Joe's family stood over her discussing whether she was faking. Thought about Joe taking her phone, about his mother suggesting she beg on her knees. An hour might as well have been an eternity when measured against the cruelty of people who should have loved her. How long have I been here? This is your 4th day. You were in surgery for hours, and then you needed time to stabilize. We kept you sedated because your body needed to heal without the stress of consciousness. The nurse paused, choosing her words carefully. Beth, when you came in, you had extensive bruising. Your shoulder was dislocated from the fall. There were older injuries too, things that made the emergency room doctor ask questions. The door opened before Beth could respond. Joe walked in carrying flowers, expensive ones. The kind that came from the upscale florist downtown and cost more than Beth used to spend on groceries. He dressed in his best suit, the charcoal one that made him look like he belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. His face arranged itself into an expression of concern that might have fooled someone who didn't know him. "Baby." He rushed to the bedside, setting the flowers on the table and reaching for her hand. His grip was firm, just shy of painful, his thumb pressing into the pulse point of her wrist in a way that looked tender but felt like a warning. "Thank God you're awake. I've been so worried." The nurse stood, her expression cooling several degrees. "Mr. Denley, I wasn't aware visiting hours had started. I'm her husband." Joe didn't look at the nurse, his eyes fixed on Beth with an intensity that made her want to sink into the mattress and disappear. "I have every right to be here. Even so, your wife needs rest. Perhaps you could come back later when she's had more time to recover." "I'll decide what my wife needs." Joe's voice stayed pleasant, but something dangerous flickered beneath the surface. "We're family. We need privacy to discuss our son." The nurse hesitated, glancing between them. Beth wanted to scream at her to stay, to not leave her alone with Joe, but the words stuck in her throat like broken glass. The nurse's pager beeped, giving her an excuse to leave, and then Beth was alone with her husband and the expensive flowers that smelled like a funeral. Joe waited until the door closed completely. Then his hand tightened on her wrist until the bones ground together. "What did you tell them?" His voice dropped to a whisper, intimate and lethal. "What lies did you spread about our family?" Nothing." "I didn't say anything." Beth tried to pull her hand back, but his grip was iron. "Joe, you're hurting me." "I'm hurting you?" He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You have no idea what hurt is. Do you know what you've done? My parents had to deal with paramedics showing up at our house, questions about why we didn't call for help sooner. My father's reputation could be damaged by this. I almost died." The words came out stronger than Beth expected. "Our son almost died because you're weak, because you couldn't handle a simple request to make breakfast." Joe released her wrist, only to lean closer, his breath hot against her face. "You embarrassed me in front of my family. You made them think I can't control my own household. Do you have any idea what that does to a man?" The door opened again. Joe's parents entered like they owned the hospital. His mother carrying a designer bag that probably cost more than Beth's hospital bill. His father followed, his presence filling the room with that judicial authority he wielded like a weapon. They looked at Beth with expressions that suggested they were visiting a particularly disappointing exhibit at a zoo. "Well," Joe's mother said, setting her bag down with careful precision, "you certainly know how to cause a scene." "Mother." Joe stepped back from the bed, his face transforming back into that concerned husband mask. "She just woke up. Maybe we should give her time." "Time for what?" "To concoct more stories." His father moved to the foot of the bed, hands clasped behind his back. "The nurses have been asking questions, Beth, uncomfortable questions about bruising and injuries that don't quite match up with a simple fall." Beth's heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't play stupid, it doesn't suit you." Joe's mother settled into the chair the nurse had vacated. "We know you've been painting yourself as some kind of victim. It's a common tactic among women who can't handle the responsibilities of marriage. I want to see my son." Beth's voice shook but held. "Where is he? When can I hold him?" Your son, Joe's father emphasized the possessive with surgical precision, is a Denley. He'll be raised as a Denley with Denley values and Denley standards. The question is whether you'll be part of that upbringing or whether you'll continue down this path of accusations and drama. What are you saying? Beth looked between the three of them, seeing the unified front, the planned attack. Are you threatening me? Threatening? Joe's mother laughed, that same tinkling sound from the kitchen. Sweetheart, we don't make threats. We make observations. And what we observe is a woman with no family, no money, no resources of her own, who has just given birth to our grandson. A woman who could very easily be deemed unfit if the right questions were asked, the right evidence presented. You nearly killed that baby with your carelessness, his father added. That's documented. The placental abruption, the delay in treatment, because you refused to wake up to take responsibility. A judge would look at that very carefully in a custody evaluation. The walls of the hospital room felt like they were closing in. Beth couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in her ears. They were going to take her baby. They were going to use her near-death experience as proof she was unfit, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. I didn't refuse anything, she whispered. You wouldn't take me to the hospital. You said I was faking. That's your story. Joe sat on the edge of her bed, placing his hand over hers in a gesture that would look loving to anyone watching through the door window. But it's your word against ours, and there are three of us. My father's a respected retired judge. My mother volunteers at the children's hospital. I'm a professional with an impeccable reputation. And you're a woman with no job, no education beyond high school, no connections. Who do you think people will believe? Beth wanted to fight back, wanted to scream that she'd told the truth, that she had proof. But what proof did she have? The phone under the refrigerator that might have been found and destroyed by now. A text message to a friend who might not have even believed her. Here's what's going to happen. Joe's father spoke with the finality of a verdict being read. You're going to recover from this unfortunate incident. You're going to come home with us. You're going to be the mother our grandson deserves and the wife our son needs. And if you're very smart, you'll forget about any wild stories you might have considered telling. And if I don't? The question escaped before Beth could stop it. Joe's mother smiled, and it was the coldest expression Beth had ever seen on a human face. Then you'll lose everything. Your son will be raised by people who can actually provide for him. You'll be deemed an unfit mother who endangered her child through negligence. And trust me, dear, once that label attaches, you'll never shake it. Every judge in this county plays golf with my husband. Every social worker knows our family contributes generously to their departments. You have no allies here, no safety net, no way out. The machines beside Beth's bed beeped faster, tracking her rising panic. Joe squeezed her hand hard enough to leave marks, his smile never wavering. Breathe, baby. You're getting yourself worked up over nothing. We're your family. We just want what's best for everyone. He leaned in close enough that only she could hear his next words. And what's best is you keeping your mouth shut and doing exactly what you're told. Because if you don't, I promise you'll never see that baby again. Are we clear? Beth nodded, the motion tiny, defeated. What choice did she have? They held all the power, all the resources, all the connections. She was alone in this hospital room with three people who saw her as an obstacle to be managed. And her son, her precious son, was somewhere in this building fighting for his life while she couldn't even protect him from the people who should love him most. Joe's mother stood, smoothing her skirt. Good. I'm glad we understand each other. Now we'll leave you to rest. When you're discharged, we'll all go home together. Won't that be nice? They left in the same formation they'd arrived, a united front of expensive clothes and casual cruelty. The door clicked shut, and Beth was alone with the beeping. Machines and the white ceiling tiles and the knowledge that she'd just agreed to return to her prison because the alternative was losing her child. Forever. She lay there for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling nothing except the weight of her own helplessness. Then she noticed something on the bedside table, tucked under the expensive flowers Joe had brought. A business card, plain white with simple black text. The nurse must have left it, slipped it there when Joe wasn't looking. Beth picked it up with shaking fingers. It was for a legal aid clinic, and someone had written on the back in neat handwriting, "You don't have to do this alone. We can help. Ask for intake coordinator." It was the smallest thing, just a card with an address and a phone number and a handful of words. But it was something. It was proof that someone had seen past Joe's performance to the truth underneath. Someone believed her story might be worth hearing. Beth slipped the card under her pillow, pressing it flat where no one would find it. Then she closed her eyes and let herself imagine just for a moment what help might look like. What freedom might feel like, what it might mean to be believed instead of threatened, protected instead of controlled, valued instead of diminished. In the NICU, her son fought to breathe on his own, and in this sterile hospital room, Beth made a decision that would change everything. She would go home with the Denley family. She would smile and obey and play the part they demanded. But she would also watch and document and plan, because she had a son now, and he deserved a mother who fought back instead of just surviving. He deserved to see what strength looked like, even when that strength had to hide behind submission until it was ready to strike. Chapter 3. The Fortress of Silence. The Denley house felt different when Beth walked through the door carrying her son. Everything looked the same. The mahogany furniture that Joe's mother had selected, the cream carpets that showed every speck of dirt, the family portraits lining the hallway, where Beth's face never quite fit with the others. But knowing she was walking into a trap made every familiar detail feel sinister, like a museum dedicated to her own suffering. Joe took the baby carrier from her hands before she could protest. His parents stood in the foyer like sentries, watching her with expressions that dared her to step out of line. She'd named the baby during those precious moments alone in the hospital, signed the birth certificate while Joe was dealing with discharge paperwork. She'd chosen a name that meant warrior, protector, survivor. Joe had been furious when he found out, but the paperwork was already filed, the name already official. It was her first small victory, and she held onto it like a life raft in churning water. "Welcome home," Joe's mother said, the words dripping with false warmth. "I've prepared the nursery exactly as it should be. I trust you won't try to rearrange things this time." Beth nodded, too exhausted to argue. The doctors had cleared her for discharge, but her body still felt fragile, held together with stitches and willpower. Every step hurt. Every breath reminded her how close she'd come to not breathing at all. But she was here, and her son was here, and that meant she had work to do. The nursery had been transformed during her hospital stay. Gone were the soft blues and greens Beth had carefully selected, replaced with dark woods and heavy fabrics that made the room feel more like a study than a space for a baby. Joe's mother had hung portraits of Denley ancestors on the walls, stern-faced men and tight-lipped women who seemed to glare down at Beth with disapproval. "Much better," Joe's father said from the doorway. "A Denley should be raised surrounded by his heritage, not whatever juvenile nonsense you had planned." Beth bit her tongue hard enough to taste copper. She watched Joe place the carrier on the changing table, watched him look down at their son with an expression she couldn't read. For just a moment, she thought she saw something soften in his face, some flicker of genuine feeling. Then his mother spoke and the moment shattered. "He has the Denley nose." Thank goodness for that. She peered into the carrier like she was examining merchandise. "We'll need to be vigilant about his development. Make sure he doesn't inherit any unfortunate traits." The unspoken end of that sentence hung in the air. Unfortunate traits like Beth's. The baby began to fuss, that newborn cry that signaled hunger or discomfort, or just the overwhelming confusion of being alive. Beth moved toward him instinctively, but Joe's mother was faster. "I'll handle this." "You should rest." She lifted the baby with practiced efficiency, cradling him against her shoulder. "You look absolutely dreadful, Beth. Motherhood clearly isn't agreeing with you. I just got out of the hospital." Beth's hands clenched at her sides. "I almost died." "Yes, well, that's behind us now." Joe's father checked his watch, a gold piece that had belonged to his father and his father before that. "What matters is moving forward appropriately. Joe, show your wife to your old room. She'll be staying there until she's fully recovered." Beth's stomach dropped. "What? No, I need to be near the baby. He'll need to nurse through the night. We'll bring him to you when necessary." Joe's mother was already walking toward the door, the baby quiet against her shoulder. "But he'll sleep in the nursery where we can monitor him properly. After what happened, I think we can all agree that constant supervision is essential." They were taking him. Right in front of her, they were taking her son and relegating her to some distant room where she couldn't hear him cry, couldn't respond when he needed her. Beth looked at Joe, silently begging him to intervene, to be the husband he'd promised to be the father his son needed him to be. Joe avoided her eyes. "It's for the best, Beth. You need to heal. My parents will make sure he's safe." "He's safe with me." Her voice rose despite her best efforts to stay calm. "I'm his mother. You're the woman who nearly killed him through negligence." Joe's father stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the small nursery. "Let's not forget the facts here. We're being generous, allowing you to recover in our home. Don't mistake our generosity for weakness." The threat was clear. Comply or lose everything. Beth's hands shook as she watched Joe's mother disappear down the hallway with her son, his tiny head bobbing against her shoulder. Every instinct screamed at her to run after them, to tear her baby from that woman's arms, to fight with everything she had. But fighting now meant losing later, and Beth had to think long-term. She had to be smarter than her rage. Joe's old bedroom was at the far end of the house, past the master suite where his parents had installed themselves, past the guest rooms they kept pristine for visitors who never came. It still had his childhood furniture, the twin bed he'd slept in before college, the desk where he'd studied, the trophies from sports he'd barely participated in but his father had insisted mattered. Being sent here felt like punishment, like being told she wasn't worthy of adult spaces or adult consideration. "I'll have dinner sent up." Joe lingered in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "You should sleep. You look terrible. Joe." Beth sat on the edge of the narrow bed. "This isn't right. You know this isn't right. What I know is that my family is trying to help us, trying to help you, despite everything." He stepped into the room, pulling the door closed behind him. His voice dropped to that dangerous whisper she'd learned to fear. "You need to be grateful, Beth. You need to remember how easily this could go very differently." "Are you threatening me? In your childhood bedroom, are you actually threatening me?" His hand shot out, gripping her jaw hard enough to force her head back. "I'm reminding you of reality. My parents moved in here to support us. They're giving up their freedom to make sure you don't destroy our son the way you nearly destroyed yourself. The least you can do is show some appreciation." Beth jerked away from his grip, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. Joe looked at his hand like it had acted independently, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd done. Then his expression hardened, responsibility transforming into justification. "You made me do that. You always make me do things I don't want to do." He moved toward the door. "Dinner will be up soon. Eat it. Sleep. Tomorrow we'll discuss the rules for your recovery." The door closed with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Beth sat in the silence of Joe's childhood room, surrounded by evidence of the boy he'd been, and wondered when exactly he'd become the man he was now. Or if maybe this cruelty had always lived inside him, just waiting for permission to emerge. Her phone was gone, confiscated during the hospital stay and never returned. But Beth had learned to be resourceful during her marriage. She'd hidden things in places Joe wouldn't think to look, prepared for emergencies she'd hoped would never come. In the pocket of her robe, she still had that business card from the nurse. And in the bathroom attached to this sad little bedroom, she found what she was looking for behind a loose tile Joe had probably forgotten existed. An old phone, ancient by current standards, but functional. She'd bought it with cash from the grocery money, charged it in secret outlets, kept it hidden for the day when she might need a lifeline. That day had arrived. Beth locked the bathroom door and dialed the number on the card with shaking fingers. The intake coordinator answered on the third ring. Her voice was professional, warm, the kind of voice that suggested she'd heard stories like Beth's before and believed them. Beth spoke in whispers, outlining her situation in fragments, terrified that someone would hear, that the door would burst open, that this fragile chance would be ripped away before she could grasp it. "I understand." The coordinator's voice remained steady. "What you're describing is domestic abuse. Coercive control. You and your son are in danger." Hearing someone name it, claim it as real and serious and worthy of intervention, made Beth want to cry. But crying would make noise, and noise would bring Joe or his parents, so she swallowed the tears and focused on the coordinator's next words. "We have a lawyer who handles cases like yours. His name is Chris Wokes. He takes cases other people won't touch, fights battles other lawyers think are unwinnable. Would you like me to connect you with him?" "Yes." The word came out stronger than Beth expected. "Yes, please. It won't be easy. People like the Denleys, they have resources and connections. They'll fight dirty. You'll need to be brave." "I have a son." Beth looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the exhausted woman staring back. Brave is the only option left. The coordinator took down information, promised to reach out to Chris Wokes, explained that building a case would take time and patience and careful documentation. Beth listened, memorized, and then erased the call history before hiding the phone back in its secret place. She emerged from the bathroom just as someone knocked on the bedroom door. Dinner arrived on a tray, carried by Joe's mother. She set it down with exaggerated care, her eyes scanning the room like she was searching for evidence of rebellion. Beth forced herself to smile, to thank her, to play the grateful patient, grateful for scraps of kindness. The performance tasted like poison. "The baby is sleeping peacefully." Joe's mother smoothed her skirt, preparing to leave. "We'll bring him to you in a few hours for feeding. Until then, rest. Try not to worry so much. It ages a woman terribly." Beth waited until the footsteps faded completely before approaching the tray. The food looked fine, probably was fine, but she couldn't bring herself to eat it. Instead, she went to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn, the tall fence that surrounded the property, the locked gate at the end of the driveway. The Denley house had always felt like a cage. Now she could see the bars. Somewhere in this fortress, her son slept under the watchful eyes of people who saw him as property, as legacy, as anything but a child who needed his mother. Beth pressed her palm against the cold glass and made a silent promise. She would document everything. She would be patient. She would let them believe they'd won. And when the time was right, when Chris Wokes built a case strong enough to break through the Denley walls, she would take her son and walk out of this house forever. Not as a victim, but as a survivor with proof of every crime they'd committed against her humanity. The game had changed. Beth wasn't just enduring anymore, she was preparing for war. Chapter 4. The Alliance forms. 6 months transformed Beth's prison into something more calculated, more deliberate. She'd learned to move through the Denley house like a ghost, present but invisible, necessary but insignificant. Her son thrived despite everything, growing strong and curious, his laughter the only pure thing in a house built on cruelty. Every milestone he reached, every smile he gave, strengthened Beth's resolve to escape with him before this place poisoned him the way it had poisoned Joe. The documentation had become her obsession. Photos of bruises taken in bathroom mirrors with her hidden phone, voice recordings of arguments saved in encrypted folders, text messages from Joe dripping with contempt, screenshots preserved before he could delete them. The hidden phone had become her confessional, her witness, her proof that the nightmare was real and not some failing of her perception like the Denleys constantly suggested. Joe's behavior had evolved into something more insidious than simple violence. He brought women to the house now, parading them through the kitchen where Beth prepared meals, introducing them as colleagues or friends while his parents nodded approval. His mother would comment on how pretty they were, how accomplished, how much more suitable for a Denley than some nobody with nothing to offer. The humiliation was intentional, designed to break whatever remained of Beth's spirit. "This is Amanda," Joe announced one evening, his arm around a blonde woman in expensive clothes. "She's a partner at the firm. We've been working closely together." Beth looked up from the vegetables she was chopping. Amanda had the decency to look uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Joe and Beth like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Joe's mother swept into the kitchen, all warm smiles for the other woman. "How lovely to meet you. Joe has mentioned you so many times." She shot Beth a pointed look. "It's nice to see him spending time with people on his level." The knife in Beth's hand felt heavy, dangerous. She set it down carefully, wiping her hands on a towel while her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a test, she realized. They wanted her to react, to explode, to give them ammunition for their inevitable custody fight. Instead, she smiled. "Dinner will be ready soon. I hope you'll stay, Amanda." The disappointment on Joe's face was almost worth the effort it took to remain calm. He'd wanted a scene, wanted tears or accusations or anything that would prove Beth was unstable. Her composure threw him off balance, and he recovered by pulling Amanda closer, kissing her in front of his wife like it was the most natural thing in the world. Beth turned back to her vegetables and counted silently to 100. Behind her, she could hear Joe's mother offering Amanda wine, his father joining the conversation with anecdotes designed to showcase the family's importance. Nobody asked if Beth wanted wine. Nobody asked her anything at all. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Beth made her move. She'd been planning it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. The legal aid clinic had connected her with Chris Wokes, and they'd been communicating through carefully timed calls when Beth could guarantee privacy. He'd explained that she needed to leave, that staying gave the Denleys more ammunition to paint her as complicit in their control. But leaving required resources she didn't have. Chris had arranged emergency housing at a domestic violence shelter. He'd filed preliminary paperwork for custody and restraining orders. All Beth had to do was walk out the door with her son and trust that the system would protect her. It was terrifying and necessary in equal measure. She moved through the dark house like a thief, gathering the few things that mattered. Her son slept in the carrier strapped to her chest, warm and trusting against her heartbeat. The documents she'd hidden in various locations went into a small bag. The phone with all its evidence stayed charged and ready. At the front door, Beth paused, looking back at the house that had been her prison. Then she stepped into the night and didn't look back again. The shelter was across town, a nondescript building with security doors and kind-eyed staff who'd seen women arrive in worse condition than Beth. They gave her a small room with a crib, food that she didn't have to cook, and the first genuine kindness she'd experienced in months. Beth cried that first night, holding her son while he slept, letting herself feel the terror and relief of having finally escaped. Chris Wokes arrived the next morning. He was younger than she'd expected, intense in a way that suggested he took cases personally. He sat across from Beth in the shelter's common room and listened while she told her story without interruption, without judgment, without suggesting that maybe she'd misunderstood or overreacted. "What they did to you is criminal," he said when she finished. "The assault, the coercion, the deliberate delay in getting you medical care. We're going to make them answer for all of it. They said nobody would believe me. Joe's father knows every judge in the county. Then we'll find the ones he doesn't know. We'll make so much noise they can't ignore us." Chris pulled out a tablet, beginning to take notes. I need you to tell me everything again, every detail you can remember. Dates if you have them, but if not, we'll work with what you've got. The recordings and photos you mentioned, those are gold. Can I see them? Beth showed him everything. Hours passed, while Chris reviewed the evidence, his expression growing darker with each new revelation. When he finally looked up, there was something fierce in his eyes that made Beth believe, for the first time, that winning might be possible. They're going to fight dirty, he warned. They'll paint you as unstable, vindictive, a kidnapper who stole their grandson. Joe's father will use every connection he has. Are you prepared for that? I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to keep my son safe. Good, because we're going to war. The emergency restraining order hearing happened faster than Beth expected. Chris had filed with a judge outside Joe's father's social circle, a woman with a reputation for taking domestic violence cases seriously. They sat in a small courtroom, Beth holding her son while Chris presented the evidence methodically, building a case with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before. Joe arrived with an expensive lawyer, his parents flanking him like bodyguards. His face, when he saw Beth, was pure rage, barely contained beneath a veneer of hurt confusion. His lawyer stood and painted a picture of a troubled woman who'd fled with their client's child, a woman who was clearly unwell and making false accusations. Then Chris played the recordings. Joe's voice filled the courtroom, cruel and contemptuous, calling Beth worthless. His mother's laughter when Beth begged for help. His father's threats about taking the baby. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to disturbed as she listened. These recordings were made without consent, Joe's lawyer objected. They shouldn't be admissible. They were made by a woman documenting abuse in her own home, Chris countered. They're absolutely admissible, the judge agreed. She granted a temporary restraining order, ordered supervised visitation only, and scheduled a full hearing for custody determination. Joe's face went purple with rage. His father stood like he was about to charge the bench. But the decision was made, and they had no choice but to comply. Outside the courthouse, Chris put a hand on Beth's shoulder. This is just round one. They're going to come back harder. But you did it. You stood up to them and won. Beth looked down at her son, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos swirling around him. She'd won a battle, but the war was just beginning. And somewhere across town, the Denley family was regrouping, planning their counterattack, preparing to use every weapon in their considerable arsenal. But Beth wasn't alone anymore. She had Chris, she had evidence, she had the truth. And sometimes, when the system worked the way it was supposed to, that was enough. Chapter 5. The Counterattack. The Denley family didn't wait long to retaliate. Within days of the restraining order, they filed their own emergency custody petition. The paperwork was thick, professionally prepared, and filled with accusations that made Beth's blood run cold. They claimed she'd kidnapped their grandson, stolen him, in the middle of the night without warning. They produced affidavits from neighbors who swore they'd heard Beth screaming at the baby. They submitted medical opinions suggesting she was suffering from severe postpartum depression that made her a danger to herself and her child. Chris spread the documents across his desk, his jaw tight with anger. This is a coordinated attack. They've hired investigators, lined up witnesses, built a counter-narrative. It's impressive in the worst possible way. Beth sat across from him, her son sleeping in her arms. The shelter had become familiar, safe, but she knew they couldn't stay there forever. She needed a real home, a real job, a real life. But every step toward stability felt impossible when the Denleys were actively working to destroy her. What do? We fight back with truth. Chris pulled up a file on his computer. I've been doing my own digging. Joe's father has a history of judicial misconduct complaints that were buried by friends in high places. Nothing was ever proven, but the pattern is there. And Joe himself has issues we can use. He showed Beth what his investigator had uncovered. Joe had been engaged before, years ago, to a woman who'd broken it off suddenly and moved away. Chris had tracked her down and she'd agreed to talk. Her story was eerily similar to Beth's. Abuse that started slowly and escalated. A family that enabled and encouraged it. A system that protected the Denleys while dismissing her concerns. She'll testify. Beth couldn't believe it. She will. And there's more. Chris pulled up another file. Joe has a daughter from that relationship. He abandoned her completely when her mother left. Never paid support, never attempted contact. It contradicts this caring father image they're trying to sell. The custody hearing was scheduled before a different judge this time. A man Chris knew slightly, but the Denleys didn't control. Both sides came prepared for battle. Joe's lawyer was smooth, presenting their case with practiced sympathy. He painted Joe as a devoted father kept from his son by a vindictive woman. He called Joe's mother to testify about finding Beth unresponsive, about her erratic behavior, about how the family had tried to help despite her resistance. Joe's mother performed beautifully. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her voice breaking as she described her fear for her grandson's safety. She talked about Beth's refusal to accept help, her isolation, her strange moods. It was all lies or distortions, but she sold it with the conviction of someone who believed her own fiction. Then Joe took the stand. He'd transformed himself for court, wearing humility like an expensive suit. He talked about loving his son, about wanting to be present in his life, about how Beth's accusations had destroyed his reputation and his relationship with his child. He admitted to being frustrated that terrible morning, said things he regretted, but insisted he'd never intended harm. He was just a man pushed to his limit by a difficult situation. Chris let him talk, taking notes, waiting. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he started gentle, almost friendly. He asked Joe about his previous relationship, about why it had ended. Joe claimed they'd grown apart, mutual decision, no drama. Chris nodded like he believed it. Then he called Joe's ex to the stand. She was nervous, clearly uncomfortable, being back in the same room as Joe, but she was also determined. She testified about 3 years of escalating abuse, about Joe's family encouraging his behavior, about feeling trapped and terrified. She showed photographs of her own bruises, her own documented injuries. She talked about the daughter Joe had never acknowledged, never supported, never even asked about. Joe's lawyer objected repeatedly, claiming this was irrelevant to the current case. But the judge allowed it, recognizing the pattern Chris was establishing. When Joe's ex finished testifying, the courtroom felt different. Heavier with truth the Denleys couldn't spin away. Chris played the recordings again, this time with context from Beth about when and why each was made. He showed the photographs of bruises, the medical records from her hospitalization, the timeline that proved the Denleys had delayed getting her help. He called the nurse from the hospital who'd witnessed Joe's rage, who'd seen Beth's condition and known something was deeply wrong. The evidence piled up like stones in a scale, tipping slowly toward Beth's version of events. But the Denleys weren't finished. Joe's father took the stand, using his judicial experience to appear measured and reasonable. He acknowledged that the family had made mistakes, should have called for emergency services sooner, but insisted they'd been following Beth's wishes since she'd seemed coherent and refused help initially. It was a clever lie, impossible to definitively disprove. Chris attacked it from every angle, but Joe's father had decades of courtroom experience. He knew how to answer without really answering, how to appear cooperative while revealing nothing damaging. The judge called a recess, promising a decision within a week. Both sides filed out in tense silence. In the hallway, Joe's father approached Chris with measured steps. "You're making a serious mistake," he said quietly, his voice carrying that judicial authority. "You're destroying a family over misunderstandings and exaggerations. Is that really what you want your legacy to be?" Chris didn't flinch. "My legacy will be protecting people from families like yours. Careful, counselor. You're playing in a system I helped build. You think you understand how it works, but you're naive." Joe's father leaned closer. "I know where you live. I know your morning running route. I know your mother still lives on Riverside, third house from the corner. I'm simply observing that bad things happen to people who make enemies of the wrong families." The threat was clear, despite the careful wording. Chris felt ice slide down his spine, but he kept his expression neutral. "Are you threatening me in a courthouse hallway? That's bold even for you. I'm stating facts. What you do with those facts is your choice." Joe's father walked away, leaving Chris standing there with the weight of those words pressing down on him. That night, Chris called Beth from his office. He told her about the threat without sugarcoating it. She had the right to know what they were facing, what kind of people would stop at nothing to win. "I can find you another lawyer," he offered. "Someone the Denleys can't intimidate." "No," Beth's voice was firm. "You believed me when nobody else would. We finish this together." Chris felt something shift in his chest, respect mixing with determination. "Then we go harder. No more playing defense. We investigate every corner of their lives until we find something that breaks them." He hired a better investigator, someone with connections in financial crimes. Within days, they had something explosive. The Denley family had been hiding money in offshore accounts, avoiding taxes for years. Joe's father had used his position to protect wealthy friends from scrutiny in exchange for favors and contributions to accounts his wife controlled. It was a web of corruption that had stayed hidden because nobody had looked hard enough. But the financial crimes were just the beginning. The investigator found more. Patterns of the Denleys using their influence to hurt anyone who crossed them. Former employees who'd been blacklisted after asking for fair wages. A woman who'd filed a complaint against Joe's father years ago, only to find herself investigated for fraud she didn't commit until she withdrew her accusations. The Denley family had built their power on the backs of people too scared or too broken to fight back. Chris compiled everything into a comprehensive file. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was about exposing a family that had corrupted the system meant to protect people. He knew going public would make things more dangerous, would paint a target on both his and Beth's backs. But staying silent meant letting them continue hurting people. He met with Beth at the shelter, spreading the evidence across the table in the common room. "This changes everything. We can go to the authorities, push for criminal investigations. But it also means the Denleys will come after us with everything they have. They won't just try to take your son. They'll try to destroy both of us completely." Beth looked at the documents, at proof of years of corruption and cruelty. She thought about all the people the Denleys had hurt, about the woman Joe had abused before her, about the daughter he'd abandoned. She thought about her son sleeping peacefully upstairs, innocent and perfect, and deserving of a world where monsters didn't get to win just because they had money and connections. "We use it," she said, "all of it. Because if we don't stop them, they'll do this to someone else. Some other woman will end up where I was, and maybe she won't be lucky enough to escape." Chris nodded, something like pride crossing his face. "Then we're going nuclear. No holding back, no compromise. We expose everything and let the pieces fall where they will." The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating. Beth knew the Denleys would retaliate viciously, but she also knew that backing down meant teaching her son that bullies win, that power matters more than truth, that some people are simply allowed to hurt others without consequence. She refused to teach him that. She refused to let the Denleys define what was possible or acceptable or just. They'd underestimated her from the beginning, seen her as weak because she'd been kind, mistaken her patience for cowardice. Now they were going to learn the difference between submission and strategy. Chris began filing formal complaints with judicial oversight boards, sending evidence to financial crimes investigators, building a case that went far beyond simple custody. The media caught wind of it. A retired judge accused of decades of corruption, a prominent family with secrets buried in offshore accounts. Reporters started calling, digging, asking questions the Denleys couldn't simply dismiss. Joe's father's carefully constructed reputation began to crack. Former colleagues distanced themselves. The country club where he held court suddenly had scheduling conflicts when he tried to book tea times. His power had always depended on perception, on everyone believing the Denleys were untouchable. Once that perception crumbled, his influence crumbled with it. But cornered animals are dangerous, and the Denleys were cornered now. Joe started showing up places he shouldn't be, following Beth when she left the shelter for appointments, calling from blocked numbers at all hours. He was careful never to technically violate the restraining order, but his presence was a constant threat, a reminder that he was watching and waiting for her to slip up. Chris arranged for better security. Escorts to and from court appearances, cameras monitoring the shelter entrance. But he knew it wasn't enough. The Denleys were escalating, becoming more reckless as their world fell apart. Something was going to break, and when it did, someone would get hurt. The custody verdict came down on a grey morning that matched Beth's mood. The judge had reviewed everything, considered all the evidence, weighed the testimony from both sides. His decision was careful, measured, designed to protect the child while acknowledging the complexity of the situation. He granted Beth primary custody with supervised visitation for Joe, but only after Joe completed extensive counseling and anger management programs. He ordered a full investigation into the allegations of abuse and the family's financial irregularities. He made it clear that any violation of the custody arrangement or any harassment of Beth would result in immediate termination of Joe's parental rights. It wasn't everything Beth had hoped for, but it was survival. It was her son staying with her, safe from the Denleys' direct control. It was validation that her story mattered, that abuse had consequences even for powerful families. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them with questions. Chris handled most of it, but Beth made one brief statement. She said she hoped her case would make it easier for the next woman, that she'd fought not just for herself, but for everyone the Denleys had silenced over the years. Joe stood across the courthouse steps with his parents, their faces masks of barely contained fury. His father caught Chris's eye and smiled, cold and promising. The message was clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 6, The Escalation. The attacks came from directions Beth hadn't anticipated. Joe's father filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association against Chris, claiming he'd engaged in witness tampering and manufactured evidence. The allegations were absurd, easily disproven, but the investigation itself was the punishment. Chris had to spend hours defending his conduct, providing documentation, answering questions that shouldn't have needed answering. His other cases suffered. His reputation took hits in legal circles, where Joe's father still had influence. "They're trying to destroy you because of me," Beth said when Chris told her about the bar complaint. They sat in his office, her son playing with blocks on the floor between them. "They're trying to destroy me because I exposed them." "That's different." Chris rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "But I won't lie, it's working. I've lost 3 clients this week who suddenly decided they'd rather go with other representation. People are scared to associate with me." Beth felt guilt settle like stones in her stomach. Chris had sacrificed so much to help her, and now he was paying the price. "Maybe I should back off, accept the custody arrangement and stop pushing." "Absolutely not." Chris leaned forward, his intensity cutting through her doubt. "That's exactly what they want. They want you scared and compliant. We're not giving them that satisfaction." But the pressure continued mounting from every direction. Beth's hours at the bookstore were cut again, the owner awkwardly explaining that business was slow and he couldn't afford full staff. Beth suspected Joe's mother had been spreading poison in the community, turning people against her with carefully crafted lies. She was running out of money, running out of options, running out of time. Joe himself had transformed his public image with calculated precision. He started attending therapy sessions, posting about them vaguely on social media. He took parenting classes and made sure everyone knew about his dedication to being a better father. He volunteered at youth centers and showed up at community events, playing the role of reformed man seeking redemption. Some people believed him. The bookstore owner mentioned hearing Joe speak at a local business meeting about learning from mistakes and becoming the person his son deserved. "He's good," Chris admitted after reviewing Joe's social media presence. "He's building a narrative of rehabilitation while we're stuck looking vindictive for not accepting his supposed growth." Beth watched her son stack blocks, his concentration absolute and beautiful. He was walking now, babbling words that almost made sense, becoming a person with preferences and personality. The supervised visitations with Joe happened in a sterile room with a social worker present, and Beth hated every second of them. She had to hand her child to a man who'd hurt her, smile while Joe played devoted father for the social worker's benefit, then take her son back and comfort him when he cried because something in Joe's energy scared him, even if he couldn't articulate it. The worst part was that Joe was smart enough to be good during those visits. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration, never gave the social worker any reason to document concerns. He brought age-appropriate toys and engaged patiently even when the baby fussed. He was performing fatherhood the way he'd once performed being a good husband, and it was terrifyingly effective. "He's going to ask for unsupervised visits," Beth said, after one particularly difficult exchange. "I can feel it. He's building a case that he's changed." Chris nodded grimly. His lawyer already filed the motion. "Hearing is scheduled for next month." Beth felt panic rise in her throat. Unsupervised visits meant Joe could take her son anywhere, do anything, and she'd have no way to protect him. The restraining order only covered her, not their child. She tried to articulate her fears to Chris, but they came out jumbled and desperate. "We'll fight it. We have the history, the recordings, the pattern of abuse. One judge already recognized it. We'll make the next one see it too." But even Chris sounded less certain than before. The Denleys were grinding them down, using their resources to outlast Beth's capacity to fight. Then Joe's mother made her move. She started a whisper campaign that was subtle and devastating. She joined a local mothers group, positioned herself as a concerned grandmother, worried about her grandson's well-being. She never said anything directly actionable, just expressed concerns about Beth's mental state, her isolation, her struggles with employment. She framed it all with sympathy, painting herself as desperate to help a troubled daughter-in-law who kept refusing support. The mothers in the group, decent women who genuinely cared about child welfare, started looking at Beth differently when she brought her son to the park. They didn't approach her anymore. They pulled their children away when he tried to play with them. Beth found herself increasingly isolated, cut off from the community resources she desperately needed. The social worker assigned to their case started asking new questions during the supervised visits. Had Beth been attending therapy herself? Was she receiving treatment for postpartum depression? Did she have a strong support system? The questions felt loaded, designed to expose vulnerabilities the Denleys could exploit. Beth answered honestly, which meant admitting she couldn't afford therapy, and her support system consisted mainly of Chris and the shelter staff. "They're building a case that you're isolated and unstable," Chris explained after the social worker filed her latest report. "They're going to argue that Joe has done everything required of him while you've made no effort to address your own issues." "I don't have issues beyond surviving their abuse." Beth's voice rose despite her best efforts to stay calm. "How is that fair?" "It's not. But fair doesn't matter. What matters is what we can prove and what narrative the judge believes." Chris pulled up a document on his screen. "I've been investigating the social worker. She's clean, no connections to the Denleys. But she's young, inexperienced, and she believes in redemption. She wants to believe Joe has changed because that fits her worldview better than accepting some people are just cruel." Beth felt the walls closing in. Every avenue of defense seemed blocked. The Denleys had money for lawyers and investigators and therapists who'd say whatever they were paid to say. They had connections throughout the legal system. They had time to wait Beth out, knowing her resources would run dry long before theirs did. That night she stood at the window of her shelter room watching her son sleep. He looked peaceful, innocent, unaware of the battle being waged over his future. Beth thought about giving up, about accepting whatever scraps the Denleys offered, about choosing peace over justice. It would be easier. It would hurt less. Her son would grow up with a father, even if that father was Joe, even if that meant Beth spending the rest of her life diminished and controlled. Then her son stirred, reaching for her in his sleep, and Beth felt something harden in her chest. She'd promised to protect him. She'd promised he'd never grow up thinking abuse was normal, or that women existed to absorb men's cruelty without complaint. Breaking those promises for the sake of ease would betray everything she'd suffered to escape. Chris called late that night with news that changed everything. His investigator had found something, a thread they could pull that might unravel the entire Denley facade. Joe's sister had reached out through an intermediary, saying she wanted to talk. She had information about the family, things she'd witnessed growing up, secrets that explained why the Denleys were so desperate to maintain their perfect image. "Do you trust her?" Beth asked, hope and suspicion warring in her chest. "I don't trust anyone connected to that family. But desperate people do desperate things, and if she's desperate enough to turn on them, she might be useful." Chris paused. "Or it could be a trap. A way to get information about our strategy, or set us up for something worse. Meet with her anyway. What do we have to lose at this point?" Chris agreed, though Beth could hear the reluctance in his voice. They were gambling now, making moves based on desperation rather than strategy. But sometimes desperation was all you had, and you either played the hand you were dealt or folded completely. The meeting was set for the following week. In the meantime, Beth had to survive another supervised visit, another performance of normalcy while Joe played doting father, and she bit her tongue bloody to keep from screaming the truth nobody seemed willing to hear anymore. Chapter 7. The Revelation. Joe's sister looked nothing like the sneering woman who'd mocked Beth that terrible morning. She sat across from Chris in a coffee shop, far from anywhere the Denleys might frequent, her hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. Her name was Rebecca, and the fear in her eyes was genuine enough that Chris found himself believing this wasn't a setup. "I need to get out," she said without preamble. "My father controls everything. My money, my apartment, even my job at the family firm. I'm 30 years old, and I have nothing that's actually mine." Chris studied her carefully. "Why now? Why help Beth after what you did to her?" Rebecca flinched. "Because I've been where she is. Not with a husband, but with my father. He's been hitting me since I was old enough to disappoint him, which was basically always. My mother knows and doesn't care. Joe learned everything he knows about hurting women from watching our father." She pulled up her sleeve, showing bruises in various stages of healing. Then she showed Chris something more valuable, photos on her phone of documents she'd copied from her father's office. Financial records showing the offshore accounts, the bribes disguised as consulting fees, the web of corruption that funded the Denley lifestyle. She had emails where her father discussed getting judges to rule certain ways in exchange for campaign contributions. She had recordings of conversations where he coached Joe on how to manipulate the custody evaluations. "This is explosive," Chris said, scrolling through the evidence. "Why give it to me instead of going to the authorities yourself?" "Because he'll destroy me if he knows I betrayed him. But if it comes out through Beth's case, I can claim ignorance. I can say I had no idea what was in those files." Rebecca finally took a sip of coffee, her hands shaking. "I know it's cowardly, but I need to survive this too." Chris understood survival that came with compromise. He sent the files to his secure server, then looked at Rebecca with something approaching sympathy. "If we use this, it won't just hurt your father. It'll blow up your entire family. Your mother, Jo, everyone connected to the Denley name. Good. Maybe that's what it takes for something to finally change. Rebecca stood, gathering her things. I have to go. My father tracks my location through my phone, and I told him I was meeting friends for coffee. If he finds out I was with you, he'll know immediately what I've done. She left without looking back, disappearing into the afternoon crowd like she'd never been there. Chris sat with his coffee and the weight of what Rebecca had given him. This wasn't just custody evidence anymore. This was the kind of ammunition that destroyed lives and careers, that sent people to prison, that unraveled decades of carefully constructed lies. He called Beth immediately. We need to meet. I have something that changes everything. They met at his office after hours, Beth bringing her son who'd fallen asleep in his stroller. Chris spread printouts of Rebecca's evidence across his desk, watching Beth's face as she processed what she was seeing. Years of corruption, documented and undeniable. Proof that Joe's father had manipulated cases, taken bribes, destroyed people who opposed him. And most relevant to their situation, recordings of Joe's father coaching his son on how to appear reformed while planning to take full custody once he had unsupervised access. They never intended to let me keep him, Beth said, her voice hollow. All the therapy, the parenting classes, it was all performance leading up to taking him away completely. That's exactly what they planned. Your son turns 2, Joe gets unsupervised visits, and then suddenly there's an emergency where Beth is deemed unfit and Joe gets full custody. They've done it before to other women. Rebecca showed me 3 other cases where her father helped Joe's friends do the same thing. Chris leaned back in his chair, exhausted but energized by having real ammunition finally. We can stop them, but using this evidence means going nuclear. Criminal investigations, media exposure, everything that comes with destroying a powerful family. Beth looked at her sleeping son. She thought about those other women who'd lost their children to men like Joe, backed by systems corrupted by men like his father. She thought about Rebecca, trapped and controlled, despite being an adult with education and resources. She thought about the woman Joe had abused before her, the daughter he'd abandoned, all the casualties of a family that believed their money made them untouchable. We use everything. I don't care what it costs. They need to be stopped. Chris began filing complaints with federal authorities since the state system was too compromised by Joe's father's influence. He sent evidence to the FBI for the financial crimes, to judicial oversight boards for the corruption, to the media for the court of public opinion. Within days, the story exploded. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets. The national media fascinated by a story of a respected judge exposed as corrupt by the woman his son had abused. The Denley family's response was immediate and vicious. Their lawyers issued statements calling it a vendetta, claiming Beth and Chris had manufactured evidence in revenge for losing custody battles. They produced their own experts who questioned the authenticity of the recordings, suggested the documents were forged, painted Rebecca as mentally unstable and therefore unreliable. But the sheer volume of evidence was impossible to dismiss. The FBI announced formal investigations into Joe's father's financial dealings. The state bar opened disciplinary proceedings that couldn't be swept away by friendly judges. Other women started coming forward with their own stories of how the Denley family had hurt them, harassed them, silenced them over the years. Joe's carefully constructed rehabilitation narrative collapsed under scrutiny. Reporters found the woman he'd abused before Beth, interviewed her on camera, where she described the same patterns, the same escalating violence, the same family enablement. They found the daughter he'd abandoned, now a teenager, who spoke quietly about never knowing her father, about growing up knowing he'd chosen to pretend she didn't exist. The supervised visitations stopped. The social worker, faced with the growing evidence of Joe's deception and his family's corruption, recommended immediate suspension of all contact pending the outcome of criminal investigations. Beth's lawyer filed for termination. of Joe's parental rights based on the newly discovered evidence that his rehabilitation had been performance designed to facilitate taking full custody through deception. For the first time since that terrible morning in the kitchen, Beth felt like she could breathe. The Denleys were cornered, exposed, facing consequences they'd spent decades avoiding. Their power was crumbling as allies distanced themselves and institutions they'd corrupted began investigating them seriously. But cornered animals were dangerous, and the Denleys were more dangerous than most. Joe's father lost his membership at the country club where he'd held court for years. His cases were being reviewed, his decisions questioned, his entire legacy examined under harsh light. Joe lost his position at the law firm, not fired officially, but encouraged to resign while they investigated his conduct. His mother found herself unwelcome at charity events where she'd once been celebrated. The family fortress was crumbling, and they had nowhere to direct their rage except at the woman who'd exposed them. Joe started violating the restraining order, showing up at the shelter despite explicit court orders. He'd sit in his car across the street watching, making sure Beth saw him. Police were called, reports filed, but Joe would leave before they arrived and claim he'd just been driving through the neighborhood. His calls came at all hours from disposable phones that couldn't be traced. He never threatened directly, just breathed into the phone or played recordings of their son crying from those supervised visits. Psychological warfare designed to break Beth's spirit, to make her understand that even diminished and exposed, the Denleys could still hurt her. Chris arranged for Beth to move to a different shelter, one with better security and a confidential location. He hired a security consultant to teach her awareness, how to vary her routes, how to recognize if she was being followed. The custody case had become something darker, more dangerous, and Chris worried constantly about what Joe might do as his world continued collapsing. The hearing for termination of parental rights was scheduled, but Chris knew getting there safely was the real challenge. Joe had nothing left to lose, his reputation destroyed, his career over, his family legacy ruined. Men with nothing to lose made desperate choices, and Joe had already proven he was capable of violence when his control was threatened. "Maybe we should back off," Beth said one evening, watching the news coverage of the FBI raiding the Denley family offices. "We've won. My son is safe. Maybe pushing for termination of rights is too much. Backing off now doesn't make you safer. It makes you a target without resolution." Chris had seen this pattern before, victims who got close to real justice and then pulled back out of fear or exhaustion. "We finish this, Beth. We make sure Joe can never use the courts to hurt you again. That's the only way you're ever truly free." Beth knew he was right, but knowing didn't make the fear less paralyzing. She'd started this fight to protect her son, and now that fight had escalated into something that felt too big to control. The Denleys were dangerous before, when they had power and reputation to protect. Now they were dangerous in a different way, like wounded predators who'd kill anything within reach. That night, Beth held her son close while he slept, breathing in his baby smell, feeling his heartbeat against her chest. She'd come so far from that morning on the kitchen floor, from the woman who'd been too terrified to fight back. She'd found her voice, her strength, her refusal to accept that some people were simply allowed to hurt others without consequence. Stopping now would betray everything she'd suffered to get this far, so she wouldn't stop. She'd see it through to the end, whatever that end looked like, and trust that truth was stronger than the Denleys' capacity for cruelty. Chapter 8. The Trial of Truths. The courtroom felt different this time, charged with energy that came from knowing the whole world was watching. Media filled the gallery, cameras waiting outside since they weren't permitted inside. This wasn't just a custody case anymore. It was a referendum on whether the justice system could hold powerful families accountable, whether women like Beth could win against men like Joe when the scales started tipped so far in the wrong direction. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman who'd built her career prosecuting domestic violence cases before being appointed to family court. Chris had been thrilled when the case was assigned to her, knowing she understood the dynamics of abuse better than most judges. The Denleys had tried every procedural trick to get her recused, but Morrison had seen through each transparent attempt and refused to step aside. Joe's legal team was impressive. 5 lawyers in expensive suits arranged around their client like a protective barrier. They'd spent the morning presenting Joe as a victim of a vindictive system manipulated by a disturbed woman and her crusading attorney. Their strategy was to separate Joe from his father's corruption, to paint him as another casualty of Joe Sr.'s crimes rather than a willing participant. They called character witnesses who testified about Joe's good qualities, his dedication to work before he was forced to resign, his involvement in community activities. They produced therapy records showing he'd addressed his anger issues and taken responsibility for his past behavior. They even had Joe's ex-girlfriend recant parts of her testimony, claiming she'd exaggerated certain incidents because Chris had pressured her. Chris cross-examined each witness methodically, exposing inconsistencies and bias. The character witnesses all had financial ties to the Denley family, or worked in fields where Joe Sr.'s influence could hurt them. The therapy records showed Joe attending required sessions, but his therapist carefully avoided stating he'd actually changed or showed genuine remorse. The ex-girlfriend broke down under questioning, admitting Joe's lawyer had offered her money to change her story. Then it was the prosecution's turn. Chris called Beth to the stand first, walking her through the entire history of abuse, from the first time Joe had grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise through that terrible morning when she'd collapsed on the kitchen floor. Beth spoke clearly, without drama or embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. She described the systematic degradation, the isolation, the way Joe's family had enabled and encouraged his cruelty. Joe's lawyer tried to rattle her during cross-examination, suggesting she'd stayed because she wanted the Denley money, implying she'd gotten pregnant deliberately to trap Joe. But Beth didn't break. She answered each accusation calmly, pointing out that she'd run away with nothing, that she'd chosen poverty and safety over wealth and abuse, that her actions proved her motivations better than any words could. Chris called the emergency room doctor who'd treated Beth the night she was brought in. He testified about the severity of her injuries, the placental abruption that had nearly killed her and her son, the bruising that suggested ongoing abuse rather than a single incident. He described how close Beth had come to bleeding out, how another hour of delay would have definitely been fatal. His testimony was clinical, factual, devastating in its clarity about what the Denleys' delay had nearly cost. The nurse who'd witnessed Joe's hospital visit testified next, describing the rage barely hidden beneath his concerned husband performance. She talked about the bruises on Beth's wrist after he left, the fear in Beth's eyes, her own discomfort with Joe's behavior that had prompted her to leave the legal aid card. Her testimony painted Joe as threatening, even when he was trying to appear caring, exposing the calculation behind everything he did. Rebecca took the stand after lunch, her testimony the most damaging because she came from inside the family. She described growing up watching her father hit her mother, learning that women existed to serve men without complaint. She talked about how Joe had been praised for controlling his girlfriends, rewarded for the behavior that should have been condemned. She described the family planning sessions where they'd strategized about custody, discussing Beth like she was an obstacle rather than a human being. Joe's lawyers attacked Rebecca viciously, calling her a traitor motivated by greed, suggesting she'd fabricated everything for a book deal or media attention. But Rebecca had brought documentation, texts from family group chats where they'd discussed Beth's weaknesses, emails where Joe Sr. had coached Joe on legal strategy. The evidence backed up everything she said, transforming her testimony from accusation to proven fact. Chris played the recordings again, all of them, letting the jury and judge hear the Denley family's cruelty in their own voices. Joe's mother mocking Beth's pain, his father threatening to take her son, Joe himself calling her worthless, telling her to beg properly if she wanted help. The recordings were harder to hear this time, knowing what had followed those moments, knowing how close Beth had come to not surviving that morning. Joe's father was called as a hostile witness, subpoenaed despite his lawyer's attempts to shield him. He invoked his Fifth Amendment rights to avoid self-incrimination, refusing to answer any questions about his corruption or his role in coaching Joe. His silence was damning, a tacit admission that answering honestly would expose him to criminal liability. Judge Morrison noted his refusal for the record, making clear it would be weighed appropriately. The final witness was an expert in domestic violence patterns, a psychologist who'd reviewed all the case materials. She testified about coercive control, explaining how the Denley family's behavior fit classic patterns of abuse that extended beyond physical violence. She described how abusers often appear charming and reformed in public while remaining dangerous in private, how their families enable the abuse by providing resources and social cover, how victims face systematic barriers when trying to escape powerful abusers. Joe's lawyers objected repeatedly, claiming the expert was biasing the court with generalized theories rather than specific facts. But Judge Morrison allowed the testimony, noting that understanding the context of abuse was essential to evaluating the specific evidence presented. The expert's testimony gave framework to everything that had come before, showing how Beth's experience wasn't unique, but rather followed predictable patterns that occurred when abusers had money and power protecting them. Closing arguments stretched into the evening. Joe's lead lawyer gave an impassioned speech about the importance of second chances, about fathers' rights, about not punishing children by severing their relationship with a parent who'd made mistakes but was working to improve. He painted Beth as vindictive, Chris as manipulative, and the whole case as a tragedy of a family destroyed by lies and exaggerations. Chris's closing was quieter but more powerful. He simply walked the judge through the evidence chronologically, showing the pattern that emerged when you looked at the full picture rather than isolated incidents. He pointed out that Joe's remorse only appeared after he got caught, that his rehabilitation efforts stopped once they served their purpose. He reminded the judge that this wasn't about punishment but protection, that a child's safety mattered more than a father's redemption narrative. Beth Mooney didn't ask for wealth or revenge, Chris concluded. She asked for safety. She asked to protect her son from a family that views people as possessions to be controlled. Every piece of evidence in this case supports that simple truth. The question isn't whether Joe Denley deserves another chance. The question is whether his son deserves to grow up free from the dysfunction and abuse that defined his father's family. The answer should be obvious. Judge Morrison announced she'd issue a written ruling within 2 weeks, needing time to review the extensive evidence and testimony. The courtroom emptied slowly, both sides exhausted from weeks of preparation and days of trial. Beth stood with Chris in the hallway, feeling wrung out and hollowed. Chapter 9. The Unraveling. The waiting felt like drowning in slow motion. 2 weeks for Judge Morrison to decide whether Beth's son would grow up safe or spend his childhood shuttled between a mother trying to protect him and a father who'd learned cruelty from a master. Beth tried to maintain routines, to keep life normal for her son, who was blissfully unaware that his future hung in the balance of one woman's decision. The media coverage intensified rather than fading. Investigative journalists dug deeper into the Denley family history, uncovering decades of buried complaints and silenced victims. A reporter from a national outlet found court records showing Joe's father had systematically ruled against women in domestic violence cases while taking money from men's rights groups. Another discovered that Joe's mother came from old money that had been carefully hidden in trusts and offshore accounts to avoid taxes and liability. The family fortress wasn't just crumbling anymore. It was being demolished brick by brick on national television. Joe's father received formal notification that he was being investigated for judicial misconduct, bribery, and corruption. The State Bar Association suspended his law license pending the outcome of multiple investigations. His country club memberships were quietly revoked. Friends who'd defended him publicly began distancing themselves privately, unwilling to be tainted by association with someone whose crimes were becoming undeniable. Joe himself seemed to be unraveling. Chris's investigator reported seeing him at bars during the day, drunk and argumentative. His social media, which had been carefully curated to show his rehabilitation, went dark. The firm where he'd worked announced they were conducting an internal review of all cases he'd touched, concerned about potential ethical violations. His perfect life was disintegrating, and he had no skills for handling failure because he'd never been allowed to fail before. Beth should have felt vindicated, watching the people who'd tormented her face consequences for their actions. But mostly she felt exhausted and weary. The Denleys were at their most dangerous when they had nothing left to lose, and they were rapidly approaching that point. Chris had warned her to be vigilant, to never go anywhere alone, to vary her routines. The shelter had increased security after threats were called in. Vague warnings about fires and accidents that could happen to places that harbored liars. Rebecca reached out through secure channels, letting Chris know the family had essentially disowned her. She'd been cut off financially and kicked out of her apartment, but she'd also been offered a job at an organization that helped survivors of family abuse, using her legal training and insider knowledge to help others escape situations like the one she'd finally left. She was building a life that belonged to her, and despite the difficulty, she sounded lighter than she had in their previous conversations. The judge, who'd initially heard Beth's emergency restraining order case, resigned quietly, citing health reasons. But leaked emails showed Joe's father had pressured him to rule against Beth, had offered favors and implied threats. The judge's resignation letter, obtained by reporters, mentioned external pressures that compromised my ability to serve justice impartially. It was another crack in the foundation of the Denley power structure, another admission that everything Beth had claimed about their corruption was true. 10 days into the waiting period, Chris called Beth with news that shifted everything again. Joe had been arrested after showing up at his mother's house drunk and violent. Neighbors had called police when they heard shouting and breaking glass. Officers found Joe's mother with a split lip and defensive wounds on her arms. She tried to refuse to press charges, but the prosecutors, already investigating the family, pushed forward anyway. Domestic violence charges were filed, and Joe spent the night in jail. "This is huge," Chris explained when he met with Beth. "It proves the pattern isn't about you specifically. It shows Joe learned violence from his father and used it against his mother too. It destroys any remaining credibility he had about being reformed or deserving custody." Beth felt a complicated mix of emotions. She didn't wish harm on Joe's mother, despite everything the woman had done to her. But she also recognized that this violence had always been there, hidden behind the family's perfect facade. Joe's mother had enabled her husband's and son's abuse of other women while apparently suffering her own. The cycle had come full circle, and now maybe it could finally be broken. The media seized on Joe's arrest with intensity that bordered on gleeful. Headlines screamed about the abusive son of the corrupt judge, about family legacies of violence, about how privilege and power had protected dangerous men for far too long. Talk shows debated whether people like Joe could truly change, or whether his rehabilitation had always been performance. The story became bigger than Beth, bigger than the Denleys, transforming into a broader conversation about how the legal system failed survivors and protected abusers when those abusers had money and connections. Judge Morrison moved up her ruling date, clearly influenced by Joe's arrest and the mounting evidence of his continued dangerous behavior. She scheduled a hearing for the following morning, giving both sides less than 24 hours to prepare. Chris suspected Morrison had already made her decision and wanted to issue it before any more developments could complicate matters. Beth barely slept that night, holding her son while he dreamed peacefully, unaware that tomorrow would determine the course of his entire childhood. She thought about the woman she'd been when this started, terrified and controlled, convinced she deserved the treatment the Denleys gave her. She thought about the moment on that kitchen floor when she'd sent that desperate text, gambling everything on the hope that someone might care enough to help. She thought about Chris believing her when nobody else would, about Rebecca finding the courage to betray her family, about every small choice that had led to this moment. Morning came too fast and too slow, simultaneously. Beth dressed carefully, wanting to look like a capable mother rather than a victim, wanting the judge to see her as she was now rather than as she'd been at her lowest point. Chris met her outside the courthouse, his expression cautiously optimistic, but refusing to make promises he couldn't guarantee. The courtroom filled quickly, reporters and observers packing the gallery. Joe arrived with his diminished legal team, looking worse than Beth had ever seen him. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight loss, the hollowness around his eyes, the tremor in his hands that suggested he was either hungover or withdrawing from something. His mother wasn't present, still recovering from injuries her son had inflicted. His father sat in the back row, a diminished figure who'd once commanded every room he entered. Judge Morrison entered, and the room fell silent. She carried a thick folder of documents, her prepared ruling clearly extensive. She looked at both sides, her expression giving nothing away, before beginning to speak. "I've presided over family court for 15 years, she started. "I've seen parents at their worst, fighting over children while forgetting that those children are people who deserve safety and stability above all else. This case stands out, not because it's unique in its patterns, but because it so clearly illustrates how systemic corruption can enable individual cruelty." She went through the evidence methodically, analyzing each piece and explaining her reasoning. She addressed Joe's claims of rehabilitation and found them unpersuasive given his recent arrest and the pattern of deception throughout the proceedings. She examined the Denley family's behavior and concluded they'd systematically worked to undermine Beth's rights while planning to take full custody through manipulation of the legal system. The evidence shows conclusively that Joseph Denley has not changed in any meaningful way. He has learned to perform contrition while continuing to engage in controlling and violent behavior. His family has enabled this behavior for generations, creating an environment where abuse is normalized and victims are blamed for the violence inflicted upon them. Judge Morrison's voice grew stronger, more forceful. "This court will not reward that behavior or subject a child to an environment where violence is an accepted tool of control." The evidence regarding Mr. Denley Sr.'s corruption, while technically separate from this custody matter, demonstrates the family's willingness to abuse power and manipulate systems meant to protect the vulnerable. She looked directly at Joe, her expression hardening. "You had every advantage, Mr. Denley, money, education, social position, and chance after chance to demonstrate genuine change. Instead, you used those advantages to continue patterns of abuse while hiding behind a facade of rehabilitation. Your recent arrest for assaulting your own mother proves conclusively that the threat you pose is real and ongoing." Then Morrison turned to Beth, her expression softening slightly. "Ms. Mooney has shown remarkable courage in escaping an abusive situation and fighting for her son's safety despite facing a system tilted against her. She has cooperated fully with all evaluations, maintained stable housing despite limited resources, and consistently put her child's needs above her own desire for revenge or retribution." The judge looked down at her ruling, then back up at the courtroom. "Therefore, this court terminates the parental rights of Joseph Denley. He will have no legal relationship with the child, no visitation rights, and no claim to custody. The restraining order protecting Ms. Mooney is made permanent. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution related to the assault that precipitated Ms. Mooney's medical emergency." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for exits to file their stories. Joe's lawyers immediately began objecting, calling for appeals, but Morrison silenced them with a single look. Joe himself sat frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been devastation if Beth was feeling generous enough to interpret it that way. Beth felt Chris's hand on her shoulder, steadying her as relief crashed through her system like a wave. She'd won. Not just this hearing, but everything. Her son was safe. The Denleys had no legal power over them anymore. The nightmare that had started on that kitchen floor was finally, officially over. Morrison wasn't finished. I want to address everyone in this courtroom. This case should never have been this difficult. Ms. Mooney should have been believed and protected from the beginning. The fact that it took federal investigations and national media coverage for the system to function properly is a damning indictment of how we handle domestic violence cases, particularly when abusers have money and influence. I hope this case serves as a catalyst for examining and reforming how we protect survivors and hold abusers accountable. She gathered her papers, preparing to leave. This court is adjourned. Miss Mooney, I wish you and your son every happiness. You've earned it. Outside the courthouse, cameras and microphones surrounded them. Chris handled most questions, but reporters kept asking Beth directly how she felt, what she wanted to say. She thought about everything she'd endured, every moment of fear and pain and desperate hope. She thought about other women still trapped in situations like hers, still being told they were crazy or vindictive when they tried to escape. I hope this makes it easier for the next woman, Beth said into the microphones. I hope she won't have to fight as hard as I did to be believed and protected. Nobody should have to nearly die before the system takes domestic violence seriously, and nobody's money or power should ever be allowed to override a child's safety. Someone asked if she had anything to say to Joe. Beth looked back at the courthouse, seeing him being led out by his lawyers, a broken figure who'd lost everything because he'd never learned that other people weren't possessions to control. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but she felt no pity either. I hope he learns that actions have consequences, even for people who think they're above accountability. And I hope his son never becomes the kind of man his father was. Then she walked away from the cameras, from the courthouse, from the entire chapter of her life that the Denleys had dominated. Chris walked beside her, and her son babbled happily in her arms, reaching for the sunlight like he knew they were walking into something better. Chapter 10. The Reckoning and Rebirth. 8 months later, Beth stood in the small house she'd managed to rent, using money from a victims' compensation fund and her new job at a non-profit helping domestic violence survivors. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that needed updating, but it was hers. Nobody could take it away. Nobody could use it to control her. The lease was in her name, and every morning she woke up in a space that belonged to her felt like a small miracle. Her son was walking everywhere now, chattering in sentences that almost made sense, developing a personality that was all his own and nothing like Joe. He loved books and blocks and the small dog they'd adopted from the shelter. He had no memory of the Denley house or the people who'd wanted to shape him into their image. For him, this was the only life he'd ever known, one filled with stability and gentleness and unconditional love. Beth had enrolled in college, studying social work with focus on family law. The classes were difficult. Fitting them around work and parenting required careful scheduling, but she was building towards something meaningful. She wanted to help other women navigate the system that had nearly failed her, wanted to be the voice that said, "You deserve better, and I believe you, and you're not alone." Chris came by regularly, having become not just her lawyer, but her friend and her son's godfather. They'd gotten through something together that bonded them in ways that went beyond professional relationships. He'd left his old firm and opened his own practice, specializing in family law and domestic violence cases. Business was good, because sadly there was no shortage of people needing help escaping situations like Beth's. "I have news about the Denleys," Chris said one evening, sitting at Beth's small kitchen table while her son played on the floor nearby. "Joe Sr. was formally disbarred last week. The corruption charges resulted in a conviction, and he's looking at potential prison time when sentencing happens next month." Beth absorbed this information without the triumph she might have expected to feel. Joe's father would face consequences, and that was important, but it didn't erase the damage he'd caused over decades of abusing his power. "What about Joe?" "Took a plea deal on the domestic violence charges. Mandatory anger management, probation, and a criminal record that will follow him forever. His mother finally left him and moved to another state. Rebecca told me she's staying with distant relatives and refusing all contact with her son and former husband. And Joe himself," Chris hesitated, "working at a warehouse last I heard. Lost everything. His reputation, his career, his family, any claim to his son. He's living in a small apartment and barely getting by. Some people might say he's suffering enough." Beth thought about the man who'd grabbed her at 5 in the morning and demanded breakfast while she was in labor, who'd mocked her pain and let her collapse on the kitchen floor. She thought about the patterns of cruelty that had been passed down through his family, each generation learning that violence was acceptable and women existed to absorb it. She didn't feel satisfaction in Joe's downfall, but she didn't feel guilt either. He's alive and free to rebuild his life however he wants. "That's more than he nearly left me with." Beth watched her son stack blocks, his concentration absolute and beautiful. "I hope he becomes better. I genuinely hope he learns and changes and never hurts anyone else. But that's not my responsibility anymore." Chris smiled, something like pride crossing his face. "You've come a long way from the woman who sent that desperate text message. I've come a long way from the woman who thought she deserved how they treated her," Beth corrected gently. "That's the real difference." The doorbell rang, and Beth opened it to find Rebecca standing there with a bottle of wine and a nervous smile. She'd become an unexpected ally, her testimony having been crucial and her ongoing support meaningful. She was building her own life too, working with domestic violence organizations and speaking publicly about growing up in abusive households. The three of them had formed an unlikely friendship built on shared understanding of how systems failed and how people could find strength in the most unlikely places. They sat together while the sun set, talking about cases Chris was handling, students Beth was studying with, families Rebecca was helping escape situations like the one that had defined all their lives. Beth's son played contentedly, occasionally bringing them blocks or books, demanding attention from the adults who adored him. "Do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked eventually. "Fighting so hard when it would have been easier to just disappear and start over somewhere else?" Beth considered the question seriously. Fighting the Denleys had cost her years of her life, had required her to relive trauma repeatedly in courtrooms and interviews. It would have been simpler to change her name, move somewhere they'd never find her, build a quiet life without confrontation. But simplicity wasn't always the same as right. If I'd run and hidden, they would have done it to someone else. Joe would have found another woman to abuse, his father would have continued corrupting the system, and their power would have stayed intact. Beth picked up her son, settling him on her lap. Fighting them broke something in that cycle. Other women have come forward because they saw that someone could win against families like the Denleys. That matters more than my personal peace. Chris raised his glass. To breaking cycles and building something better. They drank to that, three people who'd been damaged by the same family in different ways, who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something like healing. It wasn't neat or perfect. Beth still had nightmares sometimes. Rebecca was working through years of family trauma. Chris carried the weight of cases he couldn't win and women he couldn't save. But they were trying, and the trying itself was a form of resistance against the systems that had failed them. Later, After Chris and Rebecca had left, Beth put her son to bed in his room, with walls she'd painted herself and furniture she'd chosen because she liked it rather than because someone else demanded it. She read him stories about brave children and kind animals, about worlds where problems were solved without violence and love looked like gentleness rather than control. He fell asleep halfway through, his small hand clutching hers, trusting completely that she would keep him safe. Beth sat there in the dim glow of the nightlight, watching him breathe, feeling the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with being his mother. She'd promised him, back in that hospital room when they'd both nearly died, that she would never let anyone make her feel small again. She'd kept that promise. The case had officially ended months ago, but the real victory was this moment. Her son sleeping safely in a house where nobody shouted or hit or used love as a weapon for control. Her own life being built according to her choices rather than someone else's demands. The knowledge that she'd looked at an impossible situation and found a way through, rather than accepting that some battles couldn't be won. Beth thought about the woman she'd been on that terrible morning. 9 months pregnant and terrified, collapsing on a kitchen floor while people who should have loved her laughed and sneered. That woman had sent a single word into the darkness, hoping someone might care enough to respond. Help. Such a small word, but it had contained everything she needed to say. And help had come, in the form of emergency responders who'd gotten her to the hospital despite the Denley's delays. In the nurse who'd slipped her that business card. In Chris who'd taken her case when other lawyers saw only a losing battle. In Rebecca who'd found courage to betray her family for the sake of truth. In the judge who'd looked past the Denley money and power to see what was actually happening. In every person who'd chosen to believe Beth's story and fight for her safety. She'd learned that help existed, but you had to be brave enough to ask for it and strong enough to accept it when it arrived. She'd learned that surviving wasn't the same as living, that compliance wasn't peace, that accepting cruelty didn't make you graceful or patient. She'd learned that some fights were worth having, even when the odds seemed impossible, because winning those fights changed the odds for everyone who came after. Beth stood, pulling the blanket up around her son's shoulders, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Tomorrow she had classes and work, and her son had the playground and new words to learn. They had a life to build, day by ordinary day, creating something beautiful out of what the Denleys had tried to destroy. In the living room, she paused by the small shelf where she kept important documents. The custody ruling was there, official and final, proof that the justice system had eventually worked the way it was supposed to. Beside it was a framed photo, the only one she'd kept from the courthouse steps. It showed her holding her son, Chris standing beside them, all three of them caught in a moment of exhausted triumph. They looked tired and battle-worn, but they also looked victorious. Beth turned off the lights and went to her own room. The small space that was entirely hers, where no one entered without permission and no one's anger made the air feel dangerous. She climbed into bed with a book for her class, reading about family systems and trauma responses and how to help people heal from things that should never have happened to them. The Denleys were still out there somewhere, living their diminished lives, dealing with consequences they'd spent decades avoiding, but they were no longer her problem. They were a chapter she'd survived, a battle she'd won, a lesson in what was possible when you refused to accept that power and money meant some people were simply untouchable. Beth fell asleep thinking about tomorrow, about the future she was building, about all the ordinary moments ahead that felt extraordinary because they'd been so hard to reach. Her son was safe, she was free. The nightmare had ended, and in its place was something that looked remarkably like hope. Not the naive hope of thinking everything would be easy, but the earned hope of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged still believing that goodness existed and justice mattered, and some promises were worth keeping no matter how high the cost. In the morning, she would wake up in her own house, make breakfast without fear, and take her son to the park, where he'd play with other children whose mothers watched protectively from nearby benches. She'd go to work helping other survivors find their way out of impossible situations. She'd attend class and take notes about trauma and recovery and resilience. She'd live her life according to her choices, and that simple fact would feel like victory every single day. The Denleys had tried to break her, and they'd failed. That failure would define their legacy more than all their money and power ever had. And Beth's survival, her thriving, her transformation from terrified victim to fierce advocate, would stand as proof that sometimes the people who seem powerless find strength nobody expected them to have, and that strength changes everything.